On episode 1 of the Flatscan Revue, we'll look at the newest rhetorical tactic used by ComicsGate. Manga is outselling comics, and that's bad for some reason. We'll also look into who seems to have spawned this false dichotomy into existence, and you might be surprised who it is. We'll learn how to spot thought-terminating cliches. And speaking of thought-terminating cliches, I'll respond to a comment from eHacker, who attempted to define what woke means in my comments. Plus, Robin's bisexual in the comics, so of course there were man tears shed. And I'll share with you the very first superhero comic I ever read, and why it still inspires me to this day to make this content. But first, your Chud News Brief. Welcome to the Flatscan Revue. There's a lot to cover. First up, the news brief. This is where I'm just gonna burn through several news items real quick and just kind of cover the very basics of what's going on before we get into the main story, which is the manga versus comics thing that's been everywhere lately. First up on the news brief, Twitch streamers staged a walk-off from the platform on September 1st as a way to call attention to the recent wave of hate raids that are being aimed at mostly queer and minority streamers. A hate raid is when a bunch of insecure fart dicks flood into the chat and say things their mom won't allow them to say at the dinner table because it makes them feel like special little boys. Solidarity to those Twitch streamers. If any of you'd like to come onto the channel, onto my show, and discuss your experience, I'd be glad to have you. My email is below. Next, the quartering is going back to the well. A few years ago, Jeremy Hambley, the quartering, and a whole bunch of other, right-wing grifter YouTubers, they made a lot of content about Brie Larson and Captain Marvel and, how she's a man-hating feminist and she's, the movie's gonna bomb and all that stuff. Well, none of that was accurate, but they made a lot of money off of it. So I guess the quartering decided that he needed to, make an investment. So he started claiming that she attacked him online or something like that. It's not even worth getting into because the guy does nothing but lie and piss in his sink. But it does tell us something important. If we look at Hambley's social blade, we can see that in March, he had a huge dip in views and subscriber gains. I assume that he's trying to make sure that doesn't happen again, so he's padding out his numbers by going back to the Brie Larson well. Matt Jarbo, formerly Mundane Matt. He's a YouTuber and was once a prominent proponent of Gamergate, the reactionary man-baby collective that pissed their pants about SJWs ruining video games. Sounds familiar, right? Before petering out and branching off into several proto-fascist movements. Matt seems to have experienced some growth, though, as this video shows.
The quartering, geeks and gamers, Nerdrotic, Doomcock are people who proliferate fake news constantly. Everything is a woke agenda. Everything is communist. They put together this idea that everything coming out of the entertainment industry is bad, and they are the ones who are going to stand up to the bully. They see themselves as being something like Edward R. Murrow, a journalist made famous for his standing up to Joseph McCarthy. And if you don't know who McCarthy is, look him up, but you probably have heard the term McCarthyism, which generally refers to reckless and unsubstantiated allegations and accusations and public attacks on character. So if you think about it for a second, all the people that are out there grifting on your anger, they're telling you Hollywood is evil through unsubstantiated allegations and how everything is woke. It almost feels like they're engaging in a witch hunt, the same kind of witch hunt that McCarthy was known for, which means that Edward R. Murrow they aren't. And McCarthy, well, I'll let you connect the dots.
Good shit, Matt. Glad a fellow Oregonian has come around to reason. Hit me up, Matt. I'd love to chat with you about, where you were, where you are now, and, what transpired in between to kind of get you to where you are. But keep up the good work, dude. This is a little bit of an older story, but I really wanted to cover it, so I'm just going to dive into it. Masters of the Universe Revelations. Kevin Smith wrote the new Netflix limited animated series called Masters of the Universe Revelations, in which he seemingly kills off the character of He-Man in the first episode, along with Skeletor. Of course, this is a fantasy show, and there are plenty of hints that He-Man will return, least of which being that he's the most well-known character in the franchise. But this didn't stop the Chud Mill from cranking out emotional meltdowns, very likely triggered by the memories of their moms not buying them the Battle Cat action figure back in 1982. This, assuming they ever were actually fans of the show, which was really just a cynical half-hour advertisement for the toys. I know this because I was a huge fan, and I look forward to every episode, back whenever I didn't realize that it was a cynical advertisement. The Netflix show actually kicks a lot of ass, far better than it has any right to be. It appeases my old ass while respecting my childhood memories of a 30-minute advertisement. And yet, the usual clown car of chuds cranked out their lazy content, crying that Smith lied because, well, it's easy to get clicks with no context inflammatory accusations such as Kevin Smith caught lying in 4K. I should just name this video that. But what they're actually whining about is the fact that the show features Tila as the central character, on a quest to do stuff. You see, if a woman is the main character, that makes it bad and woke, okay? Got it? The grift is starting to get kinda old and transparent, is it not? Disney Plus recently debuted What If, based on the classic Marvel comic series. The first episode focused on Peggy Carter, as she received the super soldier serum rather than Steve Rogers. And it was pretty damn rad in my opinion. But, of course, the chuds found a silly reason to have tantrums, this time because Peggy Carter got super buff. More buff than even Steve Rogers became after he became Captain America. They got angry at this, I guess because they're threatened by a woman who's more powerful than them, even if it's in animated form. But there were also claims of it not being consistent, since Steve didn't get so swole when he got the super soldier serum. However, this ignores the context that Steve Rogers began as a 90-pound weakling, while Peggy Carter was an average-sized woman, maybe even a little bit thicker, you know what I'm saying? So it makes perfect sense that she would be larger than OG Cap. But perfect sense doesn't come naturally to these guys. Daniela Pineda was cast as Faye Valentine in the Cowboy Bebop film. Surprise, surprise, the man-babies needed their bottles, and their diapers changed, because Daniela doesn't have the dimensions of a cartoon character. If only someone could explain the difference between animation and reality to them, but do it really sarcastically.
First, I wanted to apologize to the fans that I did not anatomically match the Faye Valentine character. 6 foot, double D size breast, 2-inch waist. You know, they looked everywhere for that woman and they couldn't find her.
Shang-Chi opens this weekend. It's gotten great reviews from critics so far, but it doesn't focus on a white lead, but in fact is dripping with Asian characters and themes. So yep, once again, the basement dwellers started review bombing the thing, and they claim that the critic score is artificially inflated. This all seems so familiar. Hey guys, maybe it's just a good movie? No? Not possible? Okay. Can't allow for that possibility, so you have to create conspiracy theories with zero evidence. Again, this is the same tactic that's been used several times now for Star Wars The Last Jedi, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, just over and over again. They think they're really clever when they do this. And I predict we'll see it again when The Eternals comes out. And probably until the sun swallows the earth. Maybe even after that. Nerdrotic, an extra gross chud YouTuber that looks like he hasn't showered in about 6 years, is using afternoon pre-sales screenshots of the theater near him to prove that nobody's gonna go see Shang-Chi, despite the fact that the same theater's evening and weekend showings are packed. These dudes have to lie to even come close to making a coherent point with their SJW woke claims. The Rocketeer is getting a sequel on Disney Plus, and they've decided to go with a black man as the titular hero. The new Rocketeer will apparently be one of the Tuskegee Airmen, who were the first African-American pilots in the US military. This makes perfect sense for the time period, and it opens up the story to a new perspective, which I'm always down for. But if you guess the chuds are big mad, you've been paying attention. Here's bitch-ass turd muncher Doomcock filling his trousers over what should be a pretty uncontroversial approach.
I've got to try and calm down before I make this video. I have just learned that once again, Disney is ruining things that I loved in the past in order to go ahead and make new consumer product for the future. Disney Plus is essentially rebooting The Rocketeer and making it, guess what? Surprise, 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 woke.
All right, that's the news brief for today. Comment below if you'd like me to cover any of these in more detail. Oh, and subscribe, hit the like thing, and hold on to your butt because the Flatscan review's just getting warmed up.
In an exclusive interview, I'm here live with director David Ayer of the 2016 film Suicide Squad. Mr. Ayer, how do you respond to the fact that your film, despite making a lot of money, was generally poorly received, and your version of Joker is pretty much the only one that has not gone down as iconic? Oh, wow. Well, okay. Despite James Gunn's movie, The Suicide Squad, not being as profitable as yours, how does it make you feel to know that his version is probably the one people will still be talking about years from now? And do you feel entitled to have the Ayer cut released just because Zack Snyder had his Snyder cut released? You're nowhere near as talented as Zack Snyder. It's okay, bud. Hey, calm down. It's okay. Can we just cut his mic? Look, go to commercial. Manga is outselling American comics. That's proof that comics are dying.
In today's main story, we're going to talk about goalposts, specifically the movement of goalposts. In recent years, the sales numbers for comic books has continued to rise, year after year. I expected that in 2020, though, that the numbers would be abysmal due to the pandemic and the lockdowns and people just generally not having a whole lot of extra income to spend. And I'm sure ComicsGate was counting on that as well, so that they could use that as proof that SJWs are destroying my comics. But when the numbers for 2020 were released, I think everybody was surprised to see that not only was the numbers really good, they were higher than 2019, which were higher than 2018, which were higher than 2017. And this created a dilemma for ComicsGate. How do you keep pushing your agenda that the comics industry is dying and using outrage clicks to translate into donations for their independent projects when the industry is so clearly not dying? In fact, pretty much every year since the inception of ComicsGate, comic book sales have risen. That poses a problem for their brand. Eventually, fans might start to catch on and the cash flow will dry up. A new narrative had to be created. Enter manga versus comics. So, is manga outselling American superhero comics? Yes, it is. But as always with the ComicsGate crowd, they're ignoring or perhaps don't comprehend the context around this fact. See, everything that they say and do is dedicated to one goal and one goal only: to convince people that comics are dying and that it's because of the SJW woke boogeyman. The truth, of course, is not so simple at all. And they rely on that fact to create outrage, which again translates into donations for products that often don't get completed or fulfilled. See my Richard Meyer video for more on that. Yes, manga outsells American superhero comics, which is a trend that began over a decade ago. I personally don't give a shit about manga, but I have friends who do, and I can definitely see the appeal even if I don't personally prefer it. It's valid. It's a valid form of comics media. Honestly, I really don't see much difference between the two in general. Of course, the formats are different, the styles are different, but both are, graphic novel formats with, narratives and fantasy elements and sci-fi narratives and stuff like that. To me, they're all comics. They're all part of the comics market. And the market sees it that way too. Superhero comics and manga are both included in the same overall market. Many of the same retailers sell both. Many fans are fans of both. It's arbitrary to pit one against the other, which is why nobody bothered to whine about it until it became necessary for their agenda, to keep people convinced that the sinister wokies are killing comics or whatever. So if manga and comics are both part of the same market, why the panic? Are they just concerned about superhero comics, not the industry as a whole? Either way, the goalposts have shifted by design of ComicsGate and the handful of propaganda outlets that regurgitate their agendas. With manga, entire stories are collected into fairly inexpensive, huge volumes, making it easier for casual readers and new fans to jump in without a lot of priming. Each manga series is a new, complete story, whereas superhero comics, even when beginning a new story, often pick up on crucial threads from previous stories. That makes manga a great entry point for new readers. But that's not all that's at play here. Manga, despite outperforming comics, is not the dominant force in the comics and graphic novel market. Kids' comics are, juvenile fiction, but you don't hear ComicsGate crying about that. Why? Because as opposed to manga, it's not convenient to their narrative and financial goals. Juvenile fiction has risen in sales a lot recently, and these books cater to an enormous demographic with parents with lots of disposable income. This demographic is much larger than comics and manga. One thing ComicsGate doesn't want you to consider is that comics, most comics, including manga, are mostly targeted at younger audiences. ComicsGate feels entitled to have stories cater to them because they grew up on superheroes and seem to think that, the comics should have matured along with them. That's asinine and, ironically, immature. But ComicsGate isn't known for their sophisticated perspective. Publishers have known for over a decade that manga was on the rise, and they've learned the hard way with things like the New 52 that books aimed at adults don't sell as well. Comics have historically been aimed at younger people, which makes it all the more repulsive that ComicsGate tries to claim that stories and characters they don't like are inherently bad. They're just not for you. Superhero comics are in no way in danger of failing. Even if they're not number one, they do need to, and seem to currently be, adjusting to reach a larger, more diverse audience. A lot of new readers don't shop at local comic book stores, so new avenues for sales have opened up. Digital, of course, is one metric ComicsGate loves to ignore. Kids' comics and graphic novels are often sold at school book fairs, which you probably had some of those when you were in elementary school. This is capitalism, adapting to a fluctuating market, making changes to stay profitable. Nothing new. This has been happening since comics began. The manga versus comics rhetoric is a false dichotomy, and anyone trying to use it on you is insulting your intelligence and simply being deceitful. Maybe the specific person who's saying it to you in a comment section or a thread, doesn't realize that it's kind of deceitful, but that's only because they were instructed to believe it by their con artist cult figures. I personally can't help but see racist undertones with the manga versus comics false dichotomy. I've got no evidence of that, which I will openly admit, but when we consider the source of this fake outrage, the person that it began with, it starts to seem more and more likely that the unspoken concern is that America is no longer number one, being edged out by Japanese products. So stick around, because later in the video, I'll tell you exactly who started this false panic. The former and failed comics pro who kicked off this newest outrage and talking point. And it's not who you might think. It's not someone I've covered before. Stick around for that.
Thought-terminating cliches.
Conservatives, religious fundamentalists, anti-SJWs, ComicsGate, whatever. They all share some rhetorical tactics, and I'd like to point it out to you so that you can kind of keep an eye out going forward. For example, they look down on people who don't use common sense, despite there being no agreed upon definition of common sense, thereby making it a fallacy. They belittle wokies, rather than engage in any real substantive discussion about the topic at hand. And when they're confronted with the consequences of their harmful, antisocial words and actions, they'll say it's cancel culture, run amok. Don't get me wrong, there's people all across the ideological spectrum that use these rhetorical tactics, but I find them most harmful coming from the right. A few other examples would be SJW, soy boy, PC or PC culture, virtue signal, Trump derangement syndrome, and my personal favorite, forced diversity. It's not really my favorite, it's actually really stupid. It's, the reason I mock it with the name of my channel. These are just a few examples, of course. There are many, many, many more. But take a long look at these words that we're going to discuss here and really ask yourself, what ideas do they convey? They often sound like folk wisdom or, some kind of a wisdom being passed down through the ages, right? How about, it's all good? That's one we often say. A lot of us say that, right? I say it. But, depending on the context, it can be pretty benign or it can be pretty sinister. It can be passive-aggressive. Either way, it's designed to stop the other person from thinking any further about the subject. God works in mysterious ways, or the agnostic version, shit happens. Both of these are reductive and simple. And if you don't challenge the meaning behind them, the intention behind these words, then you've allowed your thoughts to be terminated, so to speak, regarding the given scenario. How about, it's apples and oranges? Apples and oranges are very different things, but apples and oranges are fruits, and those are very different things from the given context that you're discussing, right? It's probably something that actually requires a more significant examination of the context and the details involved. Saying it's apples and oranges reduces the subject down to something so simple that, guess what? Thoughts get terminated. And if you're not mindful of this, you'll allow that to happen. Do as I say, not as I do. That's one you probably heard from your parents or some other authority figures. Do it because I said so. That's probably one you've heard from parents too. And I'm the parent, that's why. That's an appeal to authority fallacy, And it implies that, your parents just know best in all circumstances, and that because they're your parents, you should always do exactly what they say and never challenge it and never question it. Now ask yourself, do you think that your parents are flawless human beings? Probably not. How about, that's a no-brainer? Okay, well, that doesn't really mean anything. It kind of implies that you're an idiot if you have to think about the thing, right? So it's almost like an underhanded insult to stop you from thinking about the subject any further. Because if you do, what, do you not have a brain or something? Here's one that we hear a lot these days. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, or that's just my opinion, right? Well, not all opinions are equally valid. Some opinions are formed by research and, analysis and evaluation of a myriad of details and factors that play into the given subject. Whereas other opinions are often just kind of, plopped out of someone's ass. I had an ex-girlfriend who used to say this next one, and it would just frustrate me every single time because it's like throwing your hands up in the air and giving up on a situation. And I'm not one for that, but it is what it is. Now, up until last year, 2020, that was a relatively benign statement that you could say in like a daily situation, like, I got a speeding ticket or whatever. It is what it is. Or I didn't get the job that I really wanted. It is what it is. That's relatively harmless. But last year, we had a president who bungled the response to a global pandemic and lied about it and still does lie about it. And, just completely botched the whole thing. And in response to the hundreds of thousands of lives that had been lost due to his bungling of the scenario, his response was, now, in that context, it is what it is, takes on an entirely new meaning. It takes on an extremely cold and apathetic point of view. And it represents someone who genuinely doesn't care that they were voted into office to protect and serve the American people. And when he failed them and allowed so many of them to die, his response was to shrug off accountability by saying, it is what it is. Here's a simple one that we probably all say like on a regular basis. Whatever. I say it. I say that a lot. Depending on the context, it can be two different things. Like, let's say the concert you really wanted to go to got canceled, and you finally just go, whatever, out of frustration. Now, let's say you are driving drunk and you run over a dog or something like that. And rather than, face accountability for that, you say, whatever, and drive off. You don't tell the people that you ran over their dog. Random example, that's just a chick flick. We've probably all said that term at some point or another about some movie or another or multiple movies. But what does it mean? Is a chick flick something that's designed cynically to appeal only to women? Or is it a movie that centers around a woman's perspective? I've heard it used in both contexts, but those are two different things. The next one is a lot like that. SJW, social justice warrior. Okay, that offers a little bit of a hint at what's being expressed. Like most of us probably have an idea of what an SJW is in our mind. Some of you watching probably think I'm an SJW simply because I, speak out about equality and things like that. So is it someone who just generally speaks out about all social issues? Is that what makes an SJW? But why is that inherently a bad thing? I remember when SJW first started, entering the lexicon around 2014, 2015, and it was typically only used to identify someone who was very loud and aggressive and annoying and has blue hair. And since then, the idea around SJW has expanded to such a degree that you can basically put anyone under it that isn't on the far right. Like, let's say you don't like mouthy feminists screaming about their vaginas or whatever. Okay, that's annoying to you. Sure, that's your prerogative. It doesn't make you a bad person necessarily. But social justice is a far broader term than just feminism. So are you against all people who speak out on all social issues? Or just the blue hair ones with pronouns in their bio and whatnot? Do you even think about it? Have you really stopped to ask yourself what you are referring to when you say SJW? Funny how these thought-terminating cliches can actually terminate our own thoughts, right? Like, they're often used to cause another person to not think further about a scenario, and SJW does that as well. But yeah, really ask yourself, if this is a term that you use a lot and that you believe in unironically, ask yourself if you can really define what it means consistently. See how this only confuses the issue? I don't think that's an accident. Thought-terminating cliches are also an important part of cult indoctrination, or systematic brainwashing. For example, the Unification Church uses the cliche, "you think too much." I mean, that's a little on the nose for a thought-terminating cliche, but that's what it is. Their members, if they're expressing doubt or cognitive dissonance about their religion or whatever, the church might tell them, "You think too much." Many Christians might believe that God works in mysterious ways is an adequate answer to why a child might get leukemia and die, or why God would allow a building full of civilians to be bombed and destroyed. A political example might be, "Make America great again." Okay, well, when was it great? What exactly defines greatness? You ask different people, you get different answers. And that's the point. There's no definition to the phrase, only what the speaker implies when he says it. Then the speaker or the leader can, over time, fill in the blanks for followers by adding, subtracting, changing, manipulating, in their minds, what the definition of "make America great again" means. It starts off meaning, hey, let's lower taxes and get jobs going again, and let's stop certain religious people from immigrating into our country. Okay, that's one definition of "make America great again." But then 5 years later, the definition of "make America great" is let's go into the Capitol building while they're counting the votes from a Democratic election, and let's try and prevent that. Let's take a shit on Nancy Pelosi's desk. You see how the definition changed? The words didn't change, but the ideas in people's minds definitely changed. Thought-terminating cliches are easy to spot if you just keep this in mind. The less context that a term provides, the more a phrase dismisses or obfuscates the context of a scenario or a subject, the more likely it is to be a thought-terminating cliche. And when you encounter that, you should definitely think about it, right? I think these rhetorical tactics can more accurately be described as thought chaos cliches, in that they deceive people into thinking they're referring to the same thing when they can be and often are referring to two different things. Or they represent such a vague, ambiguous concept that anyone can project their own subjective ideas onto the term. The effect of this in a casual conversation can be relatively benign and harmless. But in the age of extreme socio-political partisanship playing out on social media all the time, well, the results aren't so harmless. In social and political context, a thought chaos cliche often hides intentions that are generally seen by most people as unethical, amoral, regressive, and malicious. A big one that's being used as a blunt object a lot these days is woke or wokeism. I've looked into the origins of this term that began in the Black community and referred to some pretty specific ideas that are relative to being an African American in the U.S. and sometimes outside of the U.S. Links below. But it's used far more commonly nowadays by conservatives and people on the right. It's been co-opted as a rhetorical tool for their agendas. In fact, a commenter under a recent video tried to define the term woke to me. And to be fair, the commenter was honest and provided a lot of insight. But I don't think he meant to be so honest, and I don't think he meant to provide the insight that he did.
What the fuck does woke even mean?
In a video a few months back, I must have mentioned something about how woke doesn't seem to have any, real definition to it. It's just kind of used however somebody wants to use it. A thought chaos cliche. This guy named E-Hacker, he's got a YouTube channel. It's larger than mine. He decided to take the time to enlighten me as to what woke means. And really, this is the best definition that anyone's ever given me. It's the best definition that I've found. Other than the original intent from the African American community, which is to, highlight, abuses and civil rights abuses and human rights abuses and everything that Black people have been faced with since they've, been in this country, essentially. So E-Hacker said, woke is somewhat complicated. It's something you have to feel, in essence. Kind of like when a music group makes you feel something, and then they sell out their music and you don't feel it anymore. You can't exactly explain why. Same thing that happens to a movie franchise, but the reason is its integrity, passion, story writing has been sacrificed for identity politics. The people you criticize are basically just pointing that out. If you never felt something for the franchise, you might not be able to sense the wokeness. So let's go through his comment and, bit by bit, I'll explain why this is really stupid and also condescending. Okay, woke is somewhat complicated. That doesn't tell us anything. That's just a more obfuscation, honestly. And not only that, it estranges the term, the way he means it, from its original intention within the African American community, right? Which was to identify ways that the African American community has been, targeted, that had their civil rights and human rights abused and violated and neglected and so on. That's what woke was originally about. So therefore, he's already using it in a new, different way that wasn't originally the intention, okay? It's something you have to feel in essence. I don't know about you watching, but I'm not like one of those spiritual woo-woo people who just, operates my life based on like vague feelings of like, oh, this is just the moon's over Sagittarius or whatever, but that's what this sounds like to me. It sounds like someone who is living his life based off of entirely subjective feelings. And this goes back to what I was just saying about thought-terminating cliches, in that you can apply your own subjective ideas and definitions to these terms. Then he goes on to say, and I find this interesting as hell, kind of like when a music group makes you feel something, and then they sell out their music and you don't feel it anymore. Notice how many times this guy has already used the word feel. I don't know about you, but I like to operate from, more tangible definitions of terms. That's one thing you'll notice about my content. I very rarely try to slip into, entirely subjective emotion-based arguments. I try to, keep it practical. I try to keep it logical. I try to lay out in a way that pretty much anyone, if they're being rational and honest, can understand, even if they don't agree with it. This doesn't tell you anything except that this guy, E-Hacker, has his very specific feelings for what woke means. He's got a lot of feelings about wokeism. Okay? Now, when it comes to the band thing, there's a band that I have loved for a long ass time. I'm old and I got really into them at a really specific time in my life. And they were actually pretty popular. They kind of had some mainstream hits. And, pretty much everybody knew who they were for a few years there. And then as time went on, they didn't put out as much mainstream music. They started experimenting more. They started, kind of not trying to just sell records, but to try to express themselves artistically, to challenge themselves musically, and so on. I have been on that ride ever since. There's been several times that they've put out an album, and it was not what I was expecting at all. But being a person with an open mind who's willing to try new experiences, in fact, I don't want to have the same musical experience over and over again. But a lot of my friends who used to like that band started telling me that, oh, they sold out and they're not good anymore. They suck now or whatever. These are all subjective things based on their personal subjective experiences and feelings and expectations. Just like what this guy is saying. Selling out is just something people like to say. It also means nothing, just like woke. So this guy is not even, he's building his definition of woke off of another thing that is also subjective and also has no set definition. And it's all based on his feelings, okay? You can't exactly explain why, he says. Well, you should be able to, buddy. If you're going to come into my comment section and try to define what a word means, you should be able to explain why. Otherwise, you're just making a fucking fool of yourself. Same thing that happens to a movie franchise, but the reason is its integrity, passion, story writing has been sacrificed for identity politics. Now, let's look at each one of those words. Integrity. What does that mean? I'm sure he has his ideas of what a film franchise's integrity is. And I'm sure I do too. Maybe we even agree on what our idea of integrity is in a film franchise. That doesn't mean that it's universal. It definitely doesn't mean that it's objective. Okay, so once again, he's operating from his feelings. Passion. This is also another, kind of nebulous term. It's something that we use colloquially a lot to, describe like how interested we are in something, how hard we work on it, how much we believe in it, how much we want to see it succeed, right? But in this case, passion, he's referring to the passion of the filmmakers, right? How does he know how passionate they are or aren't? You know, there have been lots of films that have been worked on very passionately, but they just didn't do well, or the audience didn't really receive it well. The reception of the audience doesn't have anything to do with the passion of the filmmakers. It often does, but not always. It's not just a, strict one-to-one rule. Story writing has been sacrificed for identity politics. Okay, well, what does identity politics mean? I mean, we're not talking about politics, we're talking about a film, right? Are we not? You hear this term a lot from, particularly people on the right. There's some on the far left who will use it, you know what I mean? Because it's just an easy way to dismiss people's political goals and political views, right? Identity politics, it's just taken on this negative connotation in culture these days. What does this mean? Does it mean that the film has a woman as a protagonist? And, for instance, Black Widow, right? Has a woman as the main character, several women as central characters. And it tells somewhat of a story that's really informed by women's perspectives and women's experiences, right? Why is that inherently a bad thing? Like, unless you're a closed-minded simpleton who's incapable of just watching a story from a different perspective, because that's what stories are, man. Stories are meant to be from various perspectives so that we can learn about ourselves and other people and our society, so that, we can express ourselves and have other people express themselves to us. So reducing it down to identity politics is, dishonest at best and fucking stupid at worst. The people you criticize are basically just pointing that out. Pointing what out, buddy? You just said a bunch of nonsense. A bunch of feelings-based, subjective bullshit. I know you feel like you said something here, but you didn't. If you never felt something for the franchise, you might not be able to sense the wokeness. Felt? Sense? Is this guy a therapist or something? Like, what's the deal with this guy? He sounds like he's part of some fundamentalist cult or something. When you use these terms so often and you don't even realize that they're subjective, that's a problem for you, which becomes a problem for everyone else, because then I have to read this nonsense and explain to everyone how stupid it is. Anyway, I told him, this is fucking stupid, my guy. You're saying that I'm supposed to agree with your subjective, vague, and overdramatic feelings, that everyone else should join hand in hand to denounce whatever nebulous phantoms you're trying to label as woke or SJW or PC or an agenda or any of the thought-terminating cliches you self-deceiving cowards throw out. Please, and I mean this in the most compassionate way possible, go fuck yourself in that nonsense. Come back when you can give a hard definition instead of my feelings. And of course, he took that opportunity, to respond later on like, oh, well, you just had a emotional breakdown or something. You just proved how leftists are all emotional and it's like, for one thing, he used the word feel, feelings, and sense several times in his comment, trying to define woke. I was operating, pushing back against that and telling him, you can't define things based on your own feelings, because those are your feelings, buddy. They're your feelings, right? And of course, I used the F word. I told him to go fuck himself. I called them cowards and stuff like that. So he thinks that means I'm being emotional or something like that. No, that was him. He's the one that's operating from emotion. He's just too emotionally stunted to realize it. E-hacker, I apologize for using the F word at you, buddy. Are you gonna be okay? Think about what I'm saying here, man. Get out of your content filter bubble, right? Where all you do is consume the kind of shit that tells you, woke is bad all the time. Because if this is the best you can do to define that term, sad shit, buddy. Sad shit.
Hello, viewer. You should subscribe to the channel. Why are you not subscribed already? Am I not adorable? Are we really surprised that Robin's bisexual?
In the recent comic book Batman Urban Legends #6 by Megan Fitzmartin and Bailan Ortega, white guy here, my bad, it shows Tim Drake, the third Robin, as he rescues his old friend Bernard from a cult that had kidnapped him. After all that, at the end of the story, Bernard asks Tim on a date. Tim says yes. Tim implies that he's had feelings for Bernard for a long time, that he's been compartmentalizing that part of himself that, had feelings for another man. So, Tim Drake, the third Robin, is bisexual. Does this break the character? Does it break canon? What's going on? Tim had a long relationship with another hero, Stephanie Brown. She's been known as Spoiler and Batgirl at different times. But his other most serious relationship was with his Teen Titans and Young Justice teammate, Connor Kent, also known as Superboy. He's a young clone of Superman. Now, for the most part, that relationship with Connor over the years was portrayed as just like a very, platonic but intense bromance, right? Like they were just really good buds, couple of straight dudes who really confided in each other, they trusted each other and all that. But, a lot of readers noticed over time that the feelings that they expressed for each other, the connection they seemed to have was a little more intimate than just a couple of bros broing out, you know what I'm saying? So revealing that Tim Drake is actually bisexual and has just kind of been hiding this part of himself isn't really, out of character for the character. It's kind of been something that's been in the background for quite a while now. He's also changed his superhero identity from Robin to Red Robin to Drake and then back to Robin. Something that a young person who's constantly looking for his identity and who he is, a lot of people go through that. Gay, straight, whatever. Tim Drake being queer makes a lot of sense in the meta context as well, like outside of canon. As you're probably well aware, for a long time, Batman and Robin were kind of, made the butt of gay jokes, homophobic jokes about how, that couple of guys living together and one of them wears short pants and so on. It's really easy. It's an easy joke to make. I used to make them. It's honestly lazy and overdone at this point to make those kinds of jokes. But this didn't just start on the internet a few years ago or anything, right? This has been a concept that's been in the public consciousness, maybe not as a joke. It was taken a lot more seriously in 1954 when Frederick Wortham released his book, Seduction of the Innocent. You may know that Frederick Wortham essentially, adopted a crusade against comic books, and he pretty much succeeded in killing a lot of different types of comic books that were popular at the time. Horror comics, like he was responsible for a lot of censorship in the comic book industry. He said that comics made children violent and antisocial. Characters like Batman and Robin got it the worst from Wortham, because in his mind, he saw them as a gay couple, and as he said, a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. It's pretty stupid. But back then, in the 1950s, conservatives, it's always conservatives, freaked the fuck out. Sales of comic books tanked. The whole industry came really, really close to just ending because of this one guy and his hack bullshit book, where he was basically just projecting his own, insecurities onto what he saw in comic books. Now, DC did survive, but they made a lot of changes to appease the new Comic Code Authority. One of the things that DC did in response to this to, make Batman not seem queer was created the character of Batwoman. Ironic because, more recently in the comics, she has been actually a lesbian character. So, in that way, making Robin bisexual is also a similar kind of fuck you to 1950s conservatives, and specifically Frederick Wortham, because, just fuck that guy. What a dipshit. Now, Batwoman, Kathy Kane, at the time also had a niece named Betty, who became Batgirl. And that Batgirl became a girlfriend for Robin, who was at the time Dick Grayson. But as far as they were concerned, this would put conservative parents' minds at ease so that they knew that their kids weren't going to turn into homosexual deviants or whatever. And as you probably know, eventually all of that nonsense, the panic over Batman and Robin being gay and whatever else that people were afraid of that Frederick Wortham had lied about and made shit up about. Batwoman and Batgirl were kind of written out of the comics for a long time. So the sincere panic and fear that a lot of, idiot parents had at the time, that kind of died down. But what remained in its wake was innuendo. As it became less of a thing to panic about, it then became more of a thing to joke about. DC continued to respond to this in the comics by, making Dick Grayson a ladies' man similar to Bruce Wayne. He dated Batgirl, Jim Gordon's daughter Barbara. He also dated Starfire. But with DC deciding to make Tim Drake Robin queer, bisexual in the current comic books, that's kind of a continued fuck you to Frederick Wortham and all of the nonsense that came after his crusade against comic books, right? Robin's being queer is now something to celebrate rather than something to struggle and fight against. Tim Drake was my Robin. He's the one that was introduced in the comics very shortly after I started reading comic books. But this made him the character in DC Comics that I could most relate to. I thought Batman was cool, obviously. Who didn't think Batman was cool as a kid? But I didn't really relate to him, right? Robin I could relate to. And that allowed me in a vicarious way to feel like I was Robin too. You know what I mean? Like I connected with Tim Drake. I could see myself in his position. And therefore I was in a, childlike fantasy way, I was fighting crime alongside Batman. So since I'm not bisexual and Tim Drake was my Robin and the one that I've connected with the most, how do I feel about this? It makes me happy as fuck because now there's even more kids, right, who can connect to Robin, Tim Drake, just like I did. But even more so if they're bisexual because, they're not just seeing a kid, they're seeing a bisexual kid who's able to be a badass and he can be a badass with hot women. He can be a badass with hot dudes and he can still kick lots of ass. And he's got a really great attitude. So they can see this badass superhero who just happens to have the same sexuality as them. And that's awesome. Straight fans, straight kids, straight comic book readers, you don't lose anything by Tim Drake being bisexual. It changes nothing about the character except who he dates, who he sleeps with. And it'll probably come up in conversation and stuff like that. But that's just how life is. There are bisexual people, right? They're people. There's no logic in feeling like Tim Drake's been ruined or that your childhood is destroyed or anything like that. Unless you have like a very fragile psyche and you define your childhood based on other people's connections to a thing or a fictional character's sexuality. If that's the case, you should really talk to somebody. Please.
What was your first comic book? Tell me in the comments.
The first superhero comic that I ever read. The Silver Surfer number 65. Cover date is May 1992. Oddly, he's not even silver on the cover. I think I remember opening it thinking, why is he called the Silver Surfer when he's gold? But it's just because he was being blasted by Cap'n Reptile, which is a weird, stupid name, but whatever. It's a Silver Surfer comic as a kid. Who cares? So my childhood was pretty tumultuous, okay? I had divorced parents. I won't go into details here, but a lot of things went on in my childhood in that time that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, right? Some really tragic, traumatic stuff that, just generally a lot of instability in my life as a child that, really a kid should have stability and consistency, right? At 9 years old, life was scary and confusing to me. I felt powerless as a kid. As a kid, your life is dictated by the whims of your parents. And so your quality of life and your stability and consistency is all determined by, the quality of your parents' life and their consistency and their stability. And my parents, for various reasons, were not awesome people. I can vividly remember opening this comic book for the first time. I remember the floor that I was laying on the rug. You know how little kids, lay on your belly to read things or watch TV. I did that a lot. Sometimes I still do. It's not as comfortable. I remember opening this comic, and the outside world disappeared. Whatever was going on with my parents and all around me, all of that didn't matter for the time that I was reading this comic book. I saw this godlike, shiny silver man on a surfboard flying through space. And you'd think that he would be like, whoa, let's have fun. Let's surf some space waves or whatever, right? But that's not what was happening. He had this awesome power, and yet it was noticeable to me even then that he seemed down. He seemed burdened. And of course, at that age, I didn't fully understand why, but definitely connected with him, right? Because he too was lamenting his life. And that was intriguing to me. Like, why does this guy feel so down about the situation he's in. If that was me, I'd be flying around like, hey, radical, whatever. But he was in fact controlled. His life was dictated by the whims of Galactus. It spoke to me. Silver Surfer, whose real name is Norrin Radd from the planet Zinla, his life too was dictated by the whims of a greater power that controlled him and told him who he is and what he has to do, right? Whether he likes it or not. The tragic story of Norrin Radd, his home world of Zinla, his noble sacrifice to become the Herald of Galactus simply to save his people and the woman he loved. This was, more or less Shakespeare to me at that age. Like, it was beautiful and tragic, and the emotional weight was undeniable, even though I didn't fully have the knowledge and the experience to understand it all. And it sparked a potent curiosity within me that has seldom waned. I'm compelled to search for connection with characters all the time, whether it's in comics, cartoons, TV shows, films, whatever. Whether I try or not, I'm trying to find some way to connect with the character. And this ultimately led me to seek connection with real people too. Now, I wasn't always great at it, and who is perfect at it, right? But I've always wanted to connect with people in a similar way. Like, what do we have in common? How can I understand what your life experience is, right? In the same way that Silver Surfer is disconnected from pretty much everyone else in existence, except for a few other former Heralds of Galactus, I've always felt disconnected from most people due to my neurodivergence. And then the circumstances of our life can cause us to feel alienated from others as well. And these experiences can come to define us. But this comic had such a powerful impact on my life that here I am 30 years later doing YouTube videos about people who are trying to prevent others from having connections with characters in this way, because it means that much to me. And I know it means a lot to other people too. Connecting with characters like the Silver Surfer has allowed me to cope with trauma and loss. It's allowed me to feel seen and understood. It's provided me escape and inspiration. It's provided allegory for the real world that I can, so I can process things in real life through this fictional media for over 30 years. The idea of trying to prevent anyone else from having that kind of connection, it baffles me. In the last few years, it's genuinely started to piss me off. If you're an adult who used to value these stories and characters in the same way that I did as a kid, but you somehow think it's good and virtuous and a valuable use of your time to try to gatekeep other people, especially kids, from having that same connection, or not even the same connection as you, but a different type of connection, a connection nonetheless. If you think it's a good idea to gatekeep them, bully them, harass them, to lie about the industry, to deceive casual fans and new fans into thinking comics and these films and such are inherently bad and awful, and they're ruining this and that, you're simply an asshole at best. If you then use that media that you once allegedly loved to spew bigotry, misogyny, ableism, or any other antisocial, malicious messaging, you never understood the media in the first place. You never valued it beyond what you personally gained from it. And this makes you an entitled buffoon, generally a shitty human being. Maybe you don't see in this specific Silver Surfer comic what I saw, what I still see. And that's fine. I'm not going to try to force you or convince you to agree with my connection to it. But it's equally as selfish, immature, and absurd to try to convince others that something like a Tim Drake being bisexual is somehow a bad thing.
Who started the disingenuous concern trolling about manga versus comics?
The manga is destroying comics narrative seemed to come out of nowhere, and it quickly became the most common claim cited by ComicsGate and its followers. But where did it begin? The source of this disingenuous concern trolling is like the vast majority of ComicsGate creators. A washed-up, older white dude who had marginal success earlier on but has since been relegated to deceiving fans for outrage dollars. Not only that, but he's a proponent of the cult conspiracy represented by the letter you see here. Can't really say it or this video will get taken down. Chuck Dixon was actually more than marginally successful, to be fair. He had some pretty definitive runs on Punisher and Batman in the 90s. In particular, he was the most prolific Batman writer of that entire decade. He ushered in several iconic Bat family members such as Stephanie Brown and Tim Drake Robin, who we just discussed. He's also the creator of the character Bane. Chuck Dixon, like most ComicsGate creators, if you examine their bibliography timelines, slowly began to get less work. It's relevant because this is a pattern with ComicsGate creators, as they almost universally saw their jobs decrease over the years after having some success in the field. And they've only been able to regain recognition and probably income by embracing the outrage culture and bigotry inherent to ComicsGate. I'll cover that phenomenon soon, but for now, I suggest looking at his timeline and his decreasing prominence of the work that he was hired to do. So do I think that he began to get less work because of SJW forced diversity or whatever? Nope. In the cases of many, such as Ethan Van Sciver, their anti-inclusion rhetoric and occasionally openly bigoted political statements made them a liability for Marvel, DC, and other publishers. I don't believe people should be punished for their political views necessarily, but when those views become hateful, volatile, abusive, or in Chuck Dixon's case, delusional and anti-Semitic, I don't blame companies one bit for distancing themselves from him. Not to mention, their best work was often way behind them by the time that they started sucking the clit of ComicsGate. These are once talented men who coasted on their best work for years, never challenging themselves to grow in their profession. Most likely, their goals shifted from, challenging themselves to become better creators and just rested on making money. Comics publishers are always seeking fresh ideas, exciting new storytelling, and that means fresh and exciting new creators. Some creators are able to rise to the challenge and push themselves beyond their best work, and then some, like Ethan Van Sciver and Chuck Dixon, seem to be incapable or simply too prideful to consider that they might need to grow as creators. Chuck Dixon discussed how manga was destroying superhero comics in an interview, and of course that was picked up by the usual suspects of ComicsGate propagandists. Bounding into Comics, Bleeding Fool, etc. And look for profiles on those sites soon. I'm coming for you, Avi Green, you piece of shit. Now I said Dixon's views are delusional, and I hinted at the connection. And this isn't just speculation. He's very clearly a proponent of that cult fever dream. He has a creator-owned title from 2019 being clearly branded as part of the manufactured anti-Semitic delusion called Alt Hero Q. Was co-written with openly far-right extremist Vox Day. The comic's first arc itself is titled Where We Go One, We Go All, which is the widely known cult mantra spouted by the Trump-centric conspiracists, such as the ones who attempted to violently overthrow our democratic election on January 6th. Considering all this, a picture emerges that's of a washed-up old man who refused to grow as a creator and wanted to ride on his few successes, and when that failed, he started writing terrible novels, not even bothering to get an editor or even a spell checker. And like so many other old white men, when Trump came into prominence, Dixon attached his identity to him and saw a new avenue for income. Not just income, but white male rage, entitled Feeling That He Was Owed Something, just like so many other Trump supporters. Keeping the company of someone like Vox Day says a lot about his views, not to mention the obvious Q-bait. Chuck Dixon has fallen off hard, and he hasn't even made a name for himself like Van Sciver has. But he doesn't seem to mind as long as he can blame others for his failures, a common pattern among not just ComicsGate creators, but conservatives in general. The people that make these claims, such as Chuck Dixon, Bounding into Comics, etc., have financial motivation to create this false dichotomy. But those who aren't selling comics or trying to crowdfund projects that might never get finished, they just see this as a team sport. And this is just their newest rhetorical tactic. They move the goalposts from comics are dying to this precisely because of those sales numbers. It's a thought-terminating cliché. The numbers absolutely shred their claims of recent years to pieces. Not only are comic sales higher, they're so popular that they sold more during a goddamn pandemic. Most industries saw near ruin from COVID, and the government refusing to help small businesses and regular workers. But comics are what gave people an escape from their lockdowns and constant feelings of impending doom. That fact says far more about the growing interest and the staying power of comic books than any of the insincere claims of washed-up old white men who peaked in the 90s.